So I want to talk a little bit about where the genesis of the series came from, and then the genesis of this session. So all the way back in the election of 2016, I was at my uncle's house for Thanksgiving, and everything had been going well. But sometime during dinner, somebody brought up the election, and that was going on at the time. And my younger cousins had a viewpoint that was very different from the older members of the family. And the older members of the family laid into them because they said that their view was ridiculous. And I remember sitting there, I wasn't saying anything, but I was watching my cousins squirm and try to defend themselves. And I just felt trapped watching this kind of painful scenario unfold. And I thought to myself, wow, this is very painful. And I wish I had some skills. I wish I had some insight or some knowledge that could help in a situation like this. Well, we've had a couple of elections since then. And for a lot of people, the tension and the conflict has gotten worse. So I started to say, well, part of camp's mission is to help people experience serenity, to help them experience peace in their relationships, peace in their neighborhoods. And so, what if camp got together as a community and we talked about peace building? Because we're only a few days from the election, and already the divide in our country is very clear, and it may be creeping into the relationships around you, and it may be something that's sitting there at the Thanksgiving table or something that's coloring our experience even as we go into the holidays. So that's the genesis for the series. Now, tonight's session is called Releasing and Loving the Other Side. And I'll go into the story that kind of led to this session here in a minute. But the idea from it, the releasing and loving, is just my kind of language on a little bit of a heart skill that I learned operating in situations of diversity where people had different views of the world than I did. But then the idea of the other side came from an essay that Ken Bontrager, the former director at Camp Deer Park, wrote during the last election cycle and the George Floyd crisis and Black Lives Matter crisis. He wrote a series of essays, and in those essays on race and diversity, he used the metaphor of a coffee cup. And there was a very life-changing conversation he had. You can read the essay, it's linked on our website. He had a life-changing conversation for him where somebody told him that you can only ever see one side of the cup. And in order to really have a conversation, you have to move around and see the other side. That's the genesis of this session. All right, so the story that inspired this session happened during the last election cycle and during the COVID crisis. So my wife, Susan, and I, we are a homeschooling family. Our kids are in homeschool. And at that time, our kids went to a co-op, a homeschool co-op. And that co-op, as COVID started to happen, there was a big conversation about what we should do. And the homeschool leadership decided that most of them weren't going to vax, and they didn't even want a mask. And at the time, we had started having spiritual conversations with one of the other families in the co-op, and one of their big skepticisms was, the behavior of Christians. And so when they saw this co-op that was not necessarily a Christian co-op, but run by Christians, and yet there was no official position about vaccine or masking, they felt like that was a statement that they didn't really care about their neighbors. And so we were in this position where we were watching this person move away from the faith conversations we had been having because of what was going on in the co-op. And so Susie and I, we felt very bad about it. And in solidarity with our friend, we we practiced like vaccination and masking. And so we were a little bit like feeling like, wow, we definitely want to hear people who are like, if you care about your neighbor, you're going to do this. And we felt very convicted about that. Well, I don't tell this story to say one position or the other was right, but just that Susie and I were in this position. And then during that same season, a friend of mine called me up and said, I have all these spiritually hungry people that want to start some kind of community. Most of them, a few of them are Christian, but most of them are not Christian, but they're really feeling like they need some kind of spiritual connection in the COVID crisis. The thing was, as my friend was explaining to me, these were people that didn't vax, that didn't mask, and that were very much into the alt news channels and felt like there was a lot that the mainstream news wasn't saying that then they were believing. And so I was in this situation of, we had just felt like, wow, we had taken this position because we saw something that we didn't like going on in our co-op, and now I have this friend coming to me saying, I need your help. Please help me start a spiritual community with these people. And Susie and I was a crisis for us because we were like, on the one hand, we had our own convictions, but on the other hand, we had made a commitment as we got into missions that if anybody ever asked us to help them advance the gospel, to help them form spiritual community, we would be there. And so it was like this crisis in our lives. And long story short, we did continue a work with these people, and this beautiful, amazing community has happened and flourished because of that work. But it was a situation where I had to learn navigating this diversity of opinion and very different way of seeing the world, and come to, what do I do with that? What do I do in my faith, in my ministry, in my work with these two different streams, the one that I found myself in and this one that I'm helping with. So that was the genesis of my idea for this. That experience led me to believe that, for me, it was more important to love these people and pursue whatever God's will was among them. But I wanted to share a little bit the journey that I went through to get from, I don't know if I can do this, which is where I started, to, yeah, I can do this, and this is how I'm going to engage. So just since we have Nathan here, and Nathan's our guest, I wanted to connect in and ask you, Nathan, have you ever had a similar situation where you're encountering in your work as a peace worker, as a peace educator, a group that you have a very different view of the world than the people that you're encountering? Has that ever been part of your experience?
Yeah, thank you, Ben, for this opportunity. And yeah, to dive in, I guess, to your question right away, as Ben had mentioned, I've been with Mennonite Central Committee, and I would say, yeah, more often than not, we are working in communities where people have quite different worldviews from those that we have. Um, as an MCCer, I would say that we would often go in, um, yeah, really putting aside our own worldviews to be able to understand and learn from the communities where we've been serving. Um, and maybe it's not to say that we don't ever speak our own worldviews, our own opinions, but there can be a long process for us in just learning and listening beforehand, and understanding too, maybe the situation in which we find ourselves is often that we're in service for the people with whom we are in present with. And so the idea is to learn what works for them, and that they can we can create spaces where they feel comfortable to share with us what works for them. And when we're talking about peace or peace building or development work, it's a bit different maybe than the realm of church building and missionary work. But I think a lot of the same things can apply, whether we're talking about a water project, how a community can have more sustainable access to water, if we're talking about the impact of climate change that there is on these communities and how to understand sustainable solutions. We can come in with a lot of ideas, and the international community has a lot of solutions and ideas of how to do that. But if we come in and just say this is what the research shows, or this is what best practice is showing, without having listened to the community and seeing what it is that they're saying, then they might reject the ideas that we have, or they might not feel that those ideas are coming from they don't have ownership of those ideas. And so that also makes it less sustainable, because the community themselves might not be interested in taking on those ideas. So I would definitely say there's this sense of having to put our tendencies or thoughts aside for a moment, where we can be listening and learning about what works for them. And it doesn't always mean that what the ideas that they have would be contradicting what we would think. I think often what can happen is that there can be other dynamics that we, from as outsiders, aren't considering, because we're not from the communities. We haven't had that life experience in those communities. And so it can become a sense of just not having thought of what the communities are thinking of, not necessarily always contradictory, but just that not taking all of the dynamics into play. So maybe that's, I mean, to start out there, Ben, a little bit
Yeah.
to talk about in that context.
I think that's rich, and I do think that that's even very applicable when we think about, like if you're thinking about missions, or you're thinking about peace building work or development work. There's a sense of distance, like it's out there. Sometimes it's easier if we travel, if we get on an airplane, to appreciate differences. When the
Hmm.
differences are in our own household, when the differences are live right next door to us, when the differences are maybe in our own church or our own community. Sometimes it's harder to appreciate, because we have this assumption that they should see the world the way that we see it, maybe, because we're in the same proximity.
But yeah, I would definitely say now I'm just recently coming back to the United States after serving with MCC for several years. I have kept up with the news and tried to stay aware of dynamics in the United States. But yeah, coming back and seeing the divisions just within towns, within neighborhoods, the stark differences, political opinions, ideas of how the United States should be. It does for me. It hits home a little bit, because I'm from the United States as well. I think it's important also. I mean, I'm talking about in the context of being with MCC, going elsewhere, but as we lived in Bolivia, for example, we would also see how within the same neighborhoods, the same cities, the same regions of the country, Bolivia is a country with very vast, different ideas of what a nation should look like, or what does it mean to be a country. Bolivia currently is actually called the Poly Nation of Bolivia. They changed it from one nation to Poly Nation, and the reason is that the Constitution now recognizes 36 nations that make up the people of Bolivia. And they have worked quite hard in creating a political structure that recognizes a variety of different peoples within the borders of what is Bolivia. And so it's been interesting to observe how, in that case, they're at a national level, they're structuring things to so that there can be a diversity within the country. But that's very difficult to get there, and even today, I would say there's a lot of tension within Bolivia on what should Bolivia look like as a country.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that is clear in every context is that there's a lot more diversity, not only between groups of people, but even within people. Like the
Hmm.
amount of different positions and experiences one person can represent is astounding compared to the time where people might have lived basically in one town their whole life. And
Hmm.
because of that, we have to have an appreciation. And I like that you said one of the main things that you try to do whenever you're entering a relationship is be a learner. That was one of the key things that made a big difference for me was to go in as a learner. And when I did, I really, a lot of the things in the situation I was describing that I thought before, what I discovered were all kinds of things that didn't fit my judgments or my assumptions.
Hmm.
And kind of like you're saying, you just got back from Bolivia. Uh, it changes your view when you come home, right? It
Hmm.
changes you a
Hmm.
little bit.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the experience of having been overseas and coming back. I think one thing that's been as I've observed the dialogue and the various positions that people have here in the United States, but also in Bolivia, is that it when you really get to know the people and the communities in different societies, you realize you cannot put people in a box, but we tend to do that. And it's very easy when we see the term anti-vaxxer or anti-masking to immediately create an entire image of who that person is. And we do that now quite easily, listening to the news, hearing about who's thinking of what kinds of policies, which politicians, and it becomes very easy, and it's happening more and more when we get into politicized or polarized dialogue and societies where it becomes more easier to put people in boxes and define everything about them based on certain positions, and we become more and more blind to how diverse people really are. And that maybe is where we can begin to find common ground and realize that we do have some common interests and common needs as people when we start to get to know each other a lot more closely, listening to each other. But um, I have heard many stories. It has not happened in my family specifically, but I've heard many stories where families have broken apart because of scenarios, whether during the COVID pandemic or in different ways of responding, and very emotional relationships that become broken, really broken. And one sees that, and I mean, one has to we can't ignore the emotional component that is behind those tense relationships. It's very real. That emotion, that conflict, that tension is very real. We can't ignore it. But at the same time, how can we then also look at these alternative ways of entering into dialogue, looking at perspective differently, so that we can begin to build some bridges?
Right, right. Yeah, when you talk about the strong emotion involved, last night I was with the church plant in northern New Jersey, and there was this tender moment as a community. We try to process our journey really deeply, and one of the people there, she really opened up a level of grieving over the
Hmm.
sense of like not knowing what's true anymore, and also a sense of lost truth. Now, people may say, well, no, I know it's true, or this is what's true. People may disagree with that, but what I want to say is that, I mean, people are really hurting. This is a painful experience. The level of division, the alienation that people feel, the broken relationships, it's real. And, the most important thing in my book is learning how to be able to connect. And so one of the tools there was something that kind of shifted my paradigm. And it's actually something historical that I want to talk about. It's called the two rows wampum, and I want to share my screen here so that you guys can see a picture of it. All right, so this is a picture of it right here. Um, this is the two rows wampum, and it's a belt that's woven out of seashells. So it's the Iroquois wove it, and it's a lattice, and each of those little beads are a shell, and there's white beads and purple beads. And so in 1613, the Iroquois Confederacy came to the Dutch in New Amsterdam around New York City, and they started to have conversations about how are we going to think about our relationship. And the Dutch said, our society is, and our civilization is far superior to your civilization. And so you can call us the fathers, and we're going to call you the children. Well, the Iroquois knew where that would go. When there's a situation of inequality like that and superiority, it's always either oppression or assimilation. And so they came back and they said, no, that's not appropriate. Instead, we're going to refer to each other as brothers. And the sign of it is going to be this wampum belt. And the wampum belt, the two purple stripes, represent the great ship of the Europeans and the canoe of the Native Americans that will travel down the river of life together, joined by three values: friendship, power, and forever. The idea that the bond of their agreement will be friendship, they're going to find ways to share power, and that the agreement will stand forever. And this was the basis of their treaty. Part of what I wonder in the history of colonialism is, what was lost because this treaty was not really taken seriously. So this is part of what changed my mind. When I thought about it, if there had been more respect for the American, the First Nations way when the Europeans had arrived, how would it have even changed the possible futures of America? Now, I mean, some of this is getting into my own opinions, but it's my personal conviction that some of the greatest crises that are in the world today are because certain aspects of America have been exported globally. And we have a global system where some of what we did really well, like our industrial system and material culture, have now spread very much globally. And I wonder, part of my imagination is, had we learned more of the way of the natives because we kept that intact, would we have learned different ways of respecting the land and using things materially that might have even changed the condition of the world that we have today, and what I worry the future will be for my own children? Now, you may have different views of all that, or you may agree with me totally, but the idea here is that uh, people could be in different streams, and in my mind, it was the first time maybe that I really thought about the cost of feeling your stream is so right that you eliminate somebody else's stream, or you try to like dominate or change the direction that they're going in. So this was a historical thing for me that changed my mind a little bit. And I'd be curious, Nathan, if in peace building and historical work, one, if you've seen parallels of this kind of thing, this kind of understanding among other cultures. That would be my first question. Then two, do you also feel like in your work, as you've encountered people that think very differently than you, that there's something important about the way that they think being a part of humanity together, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, it's the history of colonialism in this world is vast and big, and in the hemisphere of the Americas, specifically with the United States, and I mean, in my experience in Latin America, uh, is um, is very strong. And so, I mean, just responding a little bit or thinking a little bit about again your this domination of one stream over another. I would say that Latin America has suffered a lot of that. The United States as an economic, political, imperial power that has had different ways of swaying other powers that be to follow in their footsteps, and it's very difficult to travel in Latin America and see that. And one of my initial interests and reasons for going to Latin America was to see what is the impact that U.S. policy has had on the people and the nations of Latin America. Um, I would just say that to start out as a little bit, and in some of the reflection you've had there, Ben, with the with the belt that you show. I would say definitely in examples where maybe there's more a little bit more equality between powers to think of some examples like that. Yeah, I there's always a certain level of disbalance of power between different peoples. It often depends on when you look at a country and you see certain groups of people with a little bit more power, whether it's economic power, political power, they're favored more by, let's say, the government than other peoples. That's a common pattern, and that happens throughout the world. And so it can often be difficult to see when situations where there are two peoples that really do can live equally with next to each other because there's so many dynamics of power at play in our world. But one interesting example that comes to mind, I was talking with Ben about this. In Bolivia, there is a large population of Low German Mennonite colonies. Some of you may be aware of this, may be aware of the Mennonite colony history throughout Latin America, and Bolivia is one of those examples. Now, the colony people are favored quite heavily by the Bolivian government because of their very industrious lifestyle in agriculture. They take the land and start cultivating it and producing. And so this becomes, and for the government, this was very favorable. But as is commonly known, obviously there were people living in that land before the Mennonites arrived, and those people often had more nomadic lifestyles. And even until today, there is sort of a mix of nomadic lifestyles with settler communities happening, but they are an indigenous people, and in this case would identify as Guarani. And the Guarani people are one of the 36 nations that I mentioned that exist in Bolivia. And Bolivia has designated certain lands to the different indigenous people. And in this case, it had happened that the Mennonite colonies had purchased land that had also been designated by the government for the Guarani people. And they had purchased the land with false titles, the Mennonite colonies. Whether they knew this or not is hard to say, but there's a lot of land trafficking, how they call it there. So you might be in the know, or you might end up being tricked into buying a false title. But be that as it may, the colonies settled there. They built their houses. They built their roads, their farmsteads, like you could imagine. Whether you're here in northern Indiana or out in Kansas, where I'm from originally, they structured the land as such and started living there. And so it was very many years later then that it was that the Guarani people came to them and said, you know, actually this portion of your colony land is belongs to us and it's designated by the government. And here we have the papers to show that. And so the Guarani people and the Mennonite people, we're talking again about very stark differences of how they live and how they imagine society. They're what were they going to do? What was going to happen here? Um, in this case, the leaders of the colony and the leaders of the Guarani community decided to come to an agreement that would allow both peoples to continue to live next to each other. So they didn't force the Mennonites to say you have to leave. And the agreement came to some of the elements of the agreement came to the Mennonites into the paying annually to the Guarani people a fee for that land. And then there were some other agreements of helping with construction of a levee near a river that the Guarani community lived next to. And there, over time, they've come up with different ways of how to live next to each other. The Mennonites often have businesses that require that produce economic activity in the region, and the Guarani people, in some cases, appreciate that, whether it's finding work, helping out with the harvest season. So they have found different ways to work together. And I found that example quite interesting in this day and age where we also here in the United States are finding are trying to reconcile ourselves with a history of having taken over a land here where people existed before. And now, if we truly want to reconcile the differences, how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that can find some kind of way to move forward together as a people, as a nation? And so I thought that was an interesting story and sort of maybe giving an example there, Ben, of the two streams, finding a way to move forward together, respecting each other's culture, not asking the other to change or live differently, but continuing to respect each other's culture.
Yeah, I think that that's a strong story. And, I see that dynamic in a lot of places far away, but also close by. When you're saying about that kind of stuff, I see almost a similar dynamic for me, even with my own kids.
Mm, okay.
Like they have a different way of looking at things. Every generation does. And sometimes as a parent, I'm definitely stressed out by the way that they view the world, what's important to them, their lifestyle. It stresses me out. And there's a temptation that says one of two things. Either, like uh, use various parental tactics to try to bring them around to my point of view. That's one temptation that I feel. Sometimes I catch myself doing it. Uh, the other one would be feel like, well, I can't even relate,
Mm,
right? And so there can be a sense, like before the government got involved in the situation that you're talking about in Bolivia, there might have been people that knew that this was an issue.
hmm
And were they motivated to say, I know it's an issue, let me go and take the initiative to cross the
mm,
divide and connect to this very real place where we both live, a place where our lives intersect?
hmm
That, to say that they're figuring out now when the government's involved, that's inspirational. But to me, it's even maybe more brings more credit. It's a better witness, maybe is a way to say it. If you, when nobody's forcing you, if you find a way to find those intersections. And so with my kids, one of the biggest ways to do that is to actually sit down and try to understand, to learn, to be curious about why it is that they construct the world in the way they do, and what I can do to be supportive as they do that. That's a
hmm
whole different position of trying to convince them that the way that you look at the world is nuts, like
Yeah. That, Yeah, definitely. I mean, one word that comes to mind maybe in these more interpersonal scenarios and maybe in community spaces is empathy, and really trying to empathize and understand, not just logically maybe, but emotionally, and the identity of the people. Is behind this, the positions that we all have, whether they're like positions that are very visible, political, or if there are other positions that are more intimate or more within our family, really seeking to understand the other person and taking the time to do that without thinking about how to persuade them. So, like when you think about your children, Ben, your first thought is like, how do I convince them that I'm right? Um, and so the idea is to take a step back and say, okay, don't feel the pressure to have to convince them. And I think that's often maybe you were talking about the term releasing in your title, and I think this is maybe a similar idea. Let's take the pressure off of each other of trying to feel like we have to convince people. Like maybe it doesn't have to be that complicated to have to convince other people. Let's just first take a step in trying to understand. And I think if we breathe a step back, take a step back and breathe a little bit and just think, I just want to understand the other side. That's it. For now. There might be other steps where then you want them to understand you. And so you feel like you need to share. But if we all can take that first step and that first breath of just living into understanding one another, I think we can actually, just within that step, we can accomplish quite a bit in beginning to find where we might have a common ground. And that's maybe some of these things when we talk about having dialogue or being in conflict. Sometimes those very first steps that we take in interacting or engaging a conflict or engaging another person, those very first steps are so important in how we do that, and that can determine the trajectory of how that relationship or how that interaction is going to go forward. Just but empathy, just starting with that, I think can be a big help.
Yeah, I think that that's great. And I don't think that that's just an interpersonal thing. Something came across
Yeah,
my social media feed. Some national leader was saying, like all these policies out there, like he's a thought leader. I forget who it was exactly, but I know he was a thought leader. And people were saying, with all the policies out there, which ones will really lead to the America that we want to see? He says, well, I don't know anything on the political agendas of either party that would really lead to the country we want. But what we really need is a movement of empathy.
yeah,
And
yeah,
I really
yeah,
agree with that, that if we could
yeah,
start empathizing, it would be even more likely for what a particular party wants to get done to them to actually get it done. Because now we're so divided, it's
yeah,
gridlocked to where almost nobody can get anything that they want actually through. But with empathy, like if I know what you're trying to do, like if there's somebody that is in a space where I am and we're working on something and they're doing something I don't understand, it may irritate me.
yeah,
But if I can connect with them, and this happens sometimes at work, all you Camp Deer Park people, I'm not naming names, not nobody specifically, right? But if it happens at work, and my first instinct is like, what in the heck are they doing? I got to stop them. It's just going to get worse from there, right? But if instead what I switch to is I wonder what they're thinking, and I go
hmm
into curiosity mode and learner mode and empathy mode, usually during the process of me asking those questions, it really becomes clear what they were doing. I'm able to like take that like anxiety and negative energy and offload it. And when it finally gets to what we're going to do with our shared space or our shared task, it's really easy for us to understand the other person and find something that works for both sides.
yeah. When you mentioned learner mode too, I think some other aspects that come to mind in this peaceful practices curriculum that we have with MCC now, one of the steps is talks about curiosity. And what I like about the word and the idea of curiosity is it takes away a bit the tension of right and wrong. It's just, or this idea, we have this tendency to want to put things as in right or wrong, and or against me or for me. Curiosity. I mean, in itself, it's a very somewhat of an innocent and even kind of in some ways, kind of a playful idea. Like, I'm just curious. Like our children, the youth, young people are curious to know more. If we as adults who have lived through so much in our lives can try to find, take it again, it's sometimes I see it as taking that step back from our hard positions and just to be curious. How can we just enter into that space, take away maybe sometimes step out of the emotionally charged positions that we might feel and enter into a curiosity. And the other one is discovery. That's another aspect in this. And discovery has both an element of discovering who the other is, but also discovering more about who you are. Often we go into these positions with this idea that we already think we know everything about ourselves, but we haven't all of us to a certain degree could always do more introspection about, well, what is it really that I'm working for or that I'm fighting for? Why do I have this position? Why am I so strong in this position? And if we can do some of that introspection, then we can also come out of it a little bit more humble and prepared, I would say, in a better mental and emotional space to be able to engage other people and be curious about them as well.
Yeah, that's great. So let's take a little break from kind of like going through these ideas. We are going to get into the peaceful practices a little bit more. We're
Okay, yeah.
also going to go through a couple of scripture paradigms
Hmm.
and sift some scripture on this kind of topic. But I'd like to just open the mics for a couple of minutes and hear some reactions for the people that are listening to the call. You know, does this resound with you? Do you have some kind of insight? Is there kind of like a burning question? Let's just hear from some of you. People
I'm
that could.
hoping that as we go on, we will maybe look at when somebody puts me in a box, how do I get out?
Mm.
Oh, okay. That's a good, definitely a good perspective there. When somebody puts you in a box, so when uh, have you found that that you feel like you're in the box because they're reacting to you, or they put you in the box like from the beginning, from the get-go?
I'm talking about, it seems like in our divisive society right now, just the fact that you're a Christian can put you in a box. They automatically assume your political position, your vaccination position, your anything else because of maybe experiences they've had with other Christians. They put you in a box and they make all of these assumptions about you. How do I get out of that box? How do I find my way out of that box and help them to understand that I don't have strong opinions about each of these things, and even if I do, I'm not going to force you to have that same strong opinion.
Hmm.
um,
That's a very good question. And I mean, one thing that comes to mind when thinking about that is the importance of I mean, in the cases that you can't do this with everybody that you interact with, but in the cases that you can, um, be with relationships that maybe are closer in your life, interpersonal relationships, finding in some ways, I think finding a way to have human these interactions where we just show ourselves as human for who we are. And even if somebody is already perceiving you um, as a certain way, for example, and you're entering into some kind of a dialogue or interaction with them, um, just finding little ways to show that you're the humanity of who you are and the humanity of who each of us are. It often might be also that that person is thinking the same thing. They also might be thinking somebody is putting me in a box. And so there becomes this paradigm where we both two parties have this fear of what the other is thinking about them, and our tendency can also be then to recoil and not interact with that other person because of the fear that, well, they already think this about me. Why interact with them? Or it's just going to be a harmful interaction. It is a bit of risk taking. I think a lot of what we talk about in peace building is there's a bit of risk there. We have to we risk maybe being insulted, or maybe the other person doesn't meet us in the same place. If we're trying to reach out or reach our hand across the aisle, we don't feel like we get that reciprocation, at least right away. One's hope can be hopeful that in time there can be a way of building that relationship. But I mean, it's a little bit not very concrete exactly what I'm saying, but just finding little ways to show the humanity of who you are, and in keeping in mind that maybe that other person also has similar feelings about the world, putting them in a box as well, if that's helpful.
So, I mean, that this is a big problem, where any kind of label, uh, a lot of times in situations of division, people label because it's easy, but just like what you were saying, Nathan, people label because they're afraid. Like
Mhm.
sometimes the people that react strongly when they hear that I'm a Christian, and I'm around a lot of people that aren't Christians, their strong reaction is because they're afraid of Christians. They're actually afraid of being a target of our judgment or a target of our, like disgust, and so they're it's actually a defense to put us in a box.
Mhm.
Sometimes people will react to me. I mean, in some ways I'm not yet uh fully into the middle age thing, but I'm close enough to the middle age. I'm a white guy, like our group has taken some hits lately on, like uh social media in terms of like middle-aged white guys mansplaining and trying to control the world and stuff. And people will react sometimes just when I come into a room. I've been working with a lot of women in the faith communities that I work with, and sometimes they'll react to me and see more of the label than me, but it's because they're afraid. And if you can remember that and instead kind of reach through and, like Nathan was saying, touch on basic humanity, it has a way of like disarming that in some way. The
Mhm.
second thing that I would say is it's much more constructive to let somebody deconstruct their own stereotype than for you to try to debunk it. Those are two different things, right? So
Mhm.
when somebody has a strong stereotype of what a Christian is, rather than me try to debunk it and say that's not a Christian, you're not seeing Christians, or to be
Mhm.
defensive and be like I'm not that kind of Christian. It's more constructive to be like, okay, well, what do you mean when you say this? And why is it that you believe that? And then at some point that in kind of like it allows them to reboot the curiosity, they'll say, but is that what you believe? And then when you say
Mhm.
at that point, no, that's not what I believe, actually, it hits differently because you were open enough to let them kind of take the view apart in front of you. An example of this would be my sister-in-law, who, when she first met me and found out that I was a Christian, she was dead set against me. And so she used to like throw these shots at me sometimes, like, well, this and this, but you wouldn't believe in that because you're a Christian. Or, like she lobbed these things at me. And we had uh this one kind of like interaction around, and maybe this is I'm married into an Asian family, so maybe this is funny, maybe it's not, but it was around slurping noodles, right? And so she had noticed one of the many things that kind of irritated her about me was we were eating dinner one night and I was being very careful not to slurp my noodles. Now, the rest of the family was eating a soup with their chopsticks, and you put the end of the noodles in your mouth, and then you turn on the vacuum, and it's not a quiet thing. I don't find it disgusting, but it's not quiet. But I was from this household where it was very much, like cut the noodle off, make sure it's on your spoon, don't slurp, like it was very much like you try to make it as few noises as possible at the table. And so she's watching me do this, and this like anger is like boiling up in her. And so afterwards, she corners me and she's like, "You must think you're so superior." And I was like, "What?" She's like, "When we were eating dinner and the noodles." And I was like, "No, no, it's just I can't be comfortable slurping noodles." By the way, I've learned how to slurp noodles, just so you know, my horizons have been expanded. But at that point, I was like, "No, I don't feel comfortable slurping noodles." She's like, "Well, how can you be that way?" And I said, "Well, uh, what is it that you are feeling like I'm saying?" And she came out that you guys always think you're better than us, right? And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Do we?" And so we had this great conversation talking about cultural relativism and the good of it. But the thing that really changed is as we were taking apart like cultural relativism and the value of cultures and whether cultures are superior or not, I said, one of the interesting things is most cultures kind of instinctively, humanly feel like their way is the best way.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Mm-hmm.
cultural relativism was invented largely by an elite white academic culture that said the ultimate culture is one that denies that exists. And it was like, in the deconstruction, she was like, "Oh, suddenly I was an okay guy because I said that." But it took us taking it apart, like being human and taking it apart. I don't know
Yeah.
if that hits for anybody, but when we're talking about things that we're very passionate about, politics, religion, how you live your life, the decisions that you make, especially the stuff that is online and that there's so much heat and energy around it. It's hard sometimes to remember that whoever it is that is different from you is a human being, and you can connect on that level.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would say these scenarios are difficult and it's kind of messy. And for you to get to a point with your sister-in-law where you could have that kind of conversation, it took several very uncomfortable and conflicting moments and times but then to be able to get there. And we don't always have that with other people. I mean, we might have interactions and we're not building a long-term relationship with different people. But I would say, yeah, it's just not, it can be messy. It can be messy.
Yeah, it's okay
And
that it's
it's,
messy.
yeah, and right. We all often, there really isn't another way. It becomes that way. But we can find those moments that sometimes when I was a teacher for some time and we would talk about the teachable moments, using those moments to be able to enter into more dialogue and more conversation. And I mean, in that interaction, you're talking about. I mean, you were discovering something about each other between you and your sister-in-law, and then being able to get to a higher understanding about each other in that interaction.
Yeah, yeah, and we have discovered even more since we really developed a friendship. But it just took us, first having to wade through our humanity, and there's mess involved. But one of the strongest things about our faith is the idea of incarnation, that God didn't stay in heaven away from our mess, but he came down and got right in the middle of it. And so I really
Yeah.
see that that's necessary. Like there's a lot of pain and human need on any side of any issue. And people need that kind of connection, and for us to wade through the mess to make that connection. So I'd like to share my screen again and talk about a couple of paradigms from Scripture. So this is the Luke 5, what I call the Luke 5 model. Some of you know this as the parable of new wine. So I'm just going to read it. This is from Luke chapter 5. Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days. He also told a parable to them. No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old garment, or else he will tear the new. And also the piece from the new will not match the old. No one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the skins and will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins, and both are preserved. No man having drunk old wine immediately desires new, for he says, the old is better. And the reason that I include this scripture in here is this scripture was, I used to read this scripture with so much bias. To me, when I was a younger person, I thought of myself as innovative and cutting edge. I read this as the new is the best. And I would always say, like, all those old fogies, those people that are with tradition, with legacy, with the old way of doing things, who swim in the old stream, right? They're always trying to put us in old bottles that don't fit us anymore. And I used to read the scripture that way. And then one time when I was reading it, I came to the last verse. And the last verse is actually true. No man having drunk old wine immediately desires new, for he says the old is better, right? So the metaphor of wine is really great here because, nobody goes and pays a lot of money for last year's vintage. The really valuable wines have been around, decades, maybe even longer. That's the really valuable stuff. And connoisseurs of wine will tell you that's the best thing. And so then the fact that Jesus tacked on the end, and I noticed it one time, changed my reading. And I saw Jesus saying, even with the Pharisees who had criticized him, that he was envisioning a world where both of those things would exist. But he has some really kind of sage advice about thinking about these streams, right? And I would sum it up in this way, right? Don't take energy that a new thing needs in order to bring a fad to something old where it won't fit and may be destructive. That's an interesting takeaway. But when he talks about the cloth, put a new patch on an old garment, he's really talking about, it's not going to fit and it's maybe going to tear it, right? Don't try to contain new things in old vessels or you ruin both. With new ideas, the container must stretch and grow with the contents. But mature ideas can use the standard established container. The third point that he'd say is don't offer innovations to people for whom their thing is working. They won't see value until their taste change, though they may in time want something new or the environment may demand a different kind of wine. So in terms of like when we think about these streams, whether we think conservative or progressive, old or new, this subculture or that subculture, there's some advice here about why things need to have space to be what they are and for them to grow. And I definitely think about this having kind of three big implications. So one would be intergenerational. When it comes to us and other generations, there's a divide always between the generations and how they see things. And sometimes it can become an all-out war that breaks out at the holidays. It can come out very passive aggressively or maybe directly. It definitely makes me think about that painful Thanksgiving that I mentioned before that at the beginning of the session. But one of the things that I think is really critical is creating space for people to evolve in their views. Even those of us who have had our views for a while hold those views differently now that we've lived with them for a while. And it's important to remember that the young, especially the young growing up in a tumultuous time where there's a lot of revolution of thought and society and structure, it's important to give them time for that to settle down and for them to to figure out what it means in the world that they want to create. Interculturally, I think this is also important. And I want to note here that I view political parties as coalitions of subcultures. Like there's a cultural element to our politics, right? And a lot of the political parties, you could think of them as various like subcultures that have common interests coming together, right? And in that, do we have space for old timers and newcomers both to figure things out? Or do we try to oppose a system on them that doesn't fit, that becomes too rigid? Right? Another one would be modes of doing things. You know, there's new ways of thinking about things and old ways of thinking about things. And do we have space in our imagination that there could be both? Now, in terms of this, one of the things that was important to me is also comes from Romans 14 in the controversy about meat offered to idols. So Paul, when he wrote the letter to the Romans, there were Christians that believed you could eat meat that was offered to pagan idols, and there were Christians that believed that if you did that, you'd be condemned. And so in his letter, he explores this issue. And he says this to them: now accept one who is weak in faith, but not for disputes over opinions. One man has faith to eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Don't let him who eats despise him who doesn't eat, and don't let him who doesn't eat judge him who eats, for God has accepted him. Who are you to judge another's servant? To his Lord he stands and falls. Yes, he will be made to stand, for God has the power to make him stand. This was really important for me when I started doing this church plant, to realize that winning people, to my opinion, wasn't the point. Connecting them to God was the point. For them to connect to God and figure out what that would mean for their lives, that meant that I was winning and that the gospel was winning. But if I was convincing them or making it about my version of the world, in some ways we would both lose. And, you know, there was a lot of anxiety at first while I was doing this. It really allowed me to, like I use the language of release them and be able to truly love when I started to think like, hey, if I just point to God, it's up to God. It's not up to me. And that can take a lot of the energy away from this. So I want to make sure we have time to go over this. I want you to consider those scriptures, but Nathan, you mentioned this, and I think that a great expression of even what I was talking about in scriptures could be these peace practices. I'm going to send out session notes afterwards, and the session notes will have a link where you can download the peace practices curriculum that can be used in youth groups or Sunday schools, or you can even use it at home. It's a great guide in how to have conversation with people who you may be in conflict or disagree with in some way. And the peace practices are on my screen right now. They're curiosity, be curious, inviting a diversity of ideas and opinions. Discovery, focus on what matters. Engagement, invite the best in yourself and others. Dialogue, listen together for insights and deeper questions. Empathy, seek to understand rather than persuade. Authenticity, speak from the heart, contributing your own thinking and experience. Dignity, consider power dynamics. And transformation, welcome creativity. So Nathan, I just went over the peace practices, but how have you seen these transform conversations when they're practiced?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning this and highlighting this this evening. This is a curriculum practice that MCC has developed and has provided for often for churches that are interested. Some of you might have even heard of this. It's been out for a few years. And churches, there can be many different topics that a church decides that they want to be discussing and talking about. And so part of the idea here with peaceful practices really is just to learn how to better exercise our muscles in dialogue and in working through differences. Whether we're talking about how a church should respond to COVID. We know that churches had many different responses, whether to isolate, whether we should come back, whether people should be using masks or not. And so these became very tense conversations. And this curriculum, the idea is to start by just working our dialogue muscles, to say it that way, and these different using these different steps and chapters that Ben had put on the screen, to work through that. And it's designed for groups in a church or a Sunday school, that it's self-explanatory, to be able to facilitate it within your group, to work through a variety of activities. And we have heard from churches that this has helped them move forward to talking about different types of issues that they might be working through. It might not be that people come to agreement, a full agreement about a particular issue. And like we've said, it's not necessarily about always getting everybody to agree or to be on the same page. But I think it does provide a way for people to be able to understand one another much better, and finding solutions that then everybody can come to agreement about the solution. At least it might be that the underlying opinions or the perspectives that people have continue to be quite different and quite diverse. But can a church, or can a group, a community, find steps to move forward and that they agree upon, that allow for the diversity of opinions to continue to exist, and the respect of that diversity to continue? So I would say, there have been several churches that have used this curriculum to talk about a variety of issues. And in the information that Ben will send out, you can download it, a PDF copy of it, if you want, for free off of the MCC website. If you want hard copies, you can order them. They look like this. It's just a hard copy workbook, and you can order them for your church, or any kind of a community group that you want. And it is all theologically based, to have different scripture to help communicate these different ideas. And so, yeah, I would strongly encourage anybody, any group, any community, Sunday school class that is interested in thinking about how to dialogue more on these issues, I would encourage you to take a look at it.
Yeah, I also
Definitely.
noticed within the curriculum that MCC offers a bookmark just with the
Yeah,
practices on it. There you go.
there it
That
is.
bookmark's great because, like I would say, even if your Sunday school at church, or you can't necessarily, you don't necessarily have a group context where you can use this, it's still useful to get the curriculum, download it as a PDF, and read the perspectives, read the scriptures, read the stories in it, because it will help to solidify a different approach when differences come up. And that's one thing that we need to do is really prepare ourselves and our own skills, because it's likely that we're headed into a period of increasing anxiety. Uh, Whichever way the election goes, I don't expect you're going to turn on the TV on like November 6th or 7th, and suddenly everything's going to be calm in the world again. There's still going to be a lot of craziness going on, and maybe even more craziness. And so preparing ourselves, saying like, okay, when I hear somebody who is scared or on the attack or ranting, what's going to be my response? Does it cause me to like throw up defenses? Does it cause me to go into my own rant, to try to shout out the opposite position? What is your reaction? Or can you boot up a whole different response where you're curious and but why is it really that they feel this way? That you focus on discovery, just like these practices say. Like it'd be so useful to say, but what is it that they're saying that really matters to them?
Mm-hmm.
What really matters here? And then engagement would be like, okay, then rather than react to the rant or the energy or the negativity or whatever, I'm going to engage you as my best self, expecting that to draw out the best of you, your best self as well. This is really hard to do. It's a discipline. It can get messy, but it's worth it.
Mm-hmm. I would maybe emphasize that last point you said there, that it's worth it. I think one of the things that can be worrisome is post-election, for example, that our communities, the very communities that each of us have and that we're a part of, those are the people we live with, we interact with. That's the fabric of society, is these community spaces. And it gives me anxiety to think that those community spaces are going to be split apart because of the tension that could happen, disagreements that happen as a result of the election. We need to be even more so now, more so than ever, I would say, looking to the communities that we each belong to as a source of our life and of who we are and where we can find ways to move forward. It's not going to always be helpful to just to retreat into ourselves or only to retreat to those who we already agree with. Our churches, our communities, that's our life. That's who we are. And to find ways to have the tools ourselves, such as the peaceful practices, to be able to confront the temptation that we're going to have to want to fight back or to want to split off from the others in our communities because of political positions or other social positions that we have. I think that gives me anxiety because that the splintering of our country is going to be even more if we really can't maintain the social fabric of our communities that really hold us together. So yeah, I think it's very important. So, these practices and taking seriously the idea of being able to engage others in our community on a local level is important.
Right. And so that would be my challenge to everybody on the session here. And I would like for you to consider like having this as a challenge from now until Thanksgiving that you'll think about before it happens, a person that you're likely to rub up against who kind of rubs you the wrong way, or somebody that knows you don't agree with them, right? I want you to think of that person and think, how could you use these peace practices the next time you meet them, right? So how could you be curious? What's going on in their life? What is the best things that's happening? What are the is the worst thing that's happening? Can you connect just to the experience of them being them outside of all the issues, the big issues that where there's disagreement? Can you find things that matter to both of you? And can you engage them with the best level of your compassion? This is just the first three practices, but I encourage you to pick out somebody because, like Nathan's saying, part of our witness and our call as Christians are to be people that live reconciliation, that knit together the tears in the human social fabric. We're supposed to be the ones called to respect and see people's dignity and love even to the extent that we love the people that are identified as our enemies. And that's a great vision globally as we see a world that's tearing itself apart in various different ways. But it's also a great vision thinking about this time where we're going to share close space with people in our community, our neighbors. During this time, people they greet each other more. You're out shopping more. You're uh, there's just all these ways that our lives can intertwine, and all those intersections are opportunities for a little bit of grace and a little bit of peace for people to experience that in small ways and even big ways. I'm surprised sometimes how meaningful a small thing can be and how it can even grow over time into things that really transform lives in terms of peace. All right,
You
so
know,
yeah,
oh,
go ahead, Nathan.
well, Ben, I had done a little bit of reflecting on the verses too that you were presenting just both in Romans and in Luke. And I think in this, what feels relevant with this topic this evening too, is this idea that in the New Testament, and these verses are, I would say, one examples, but of many others, of really the kingdom of God, this sort of long-term trajectory of the kingdom of God growing and including more and more people. We see in the Bible, it starts out with one group of the people of Israel, the people of Abraham. But with Jesus and then beyond that, the kingdom is growing. And as it's growing, it's including more and more people from different backgrounds, different diversity. It's including more and more diversity. And that didn't stop with the Bible stories or the times of the Bible. It
Right.
has continued over the generations, and it's something that continues more and more today. But that diversity, it creates growing pains, right? In the Bible itself, there was a lot of conflict, a lot of tension, a lot of disagreement. There had to be dialogue about, well, how do we move forward? What does this kingdom look like now with more diversity? And I think that's a very important message for us as Christians to continue to be thinking about that how can we work with this diversity of people that are within this tent and having these tools to be able to dialogue and converse and start to interact with people that we haven't always seen eye to eye with. I think that is a calling of God is asking us to look and see how we can be including the variety of people in the kingdom, and that's our work as Christians to continue to work on making that real.
Yeah,
That's
well said, Nathan. Well said. So I just wanted to open up the mics again. If anybody has comments or wants to react or ask a question.
I appreciate that kingdom perspective. When we think of where we are as being part of a diverse kingdom, it changes maybe the intensity, the need to get other people to think like I do.
hmm. Hmm.
Mm, thanks, Debbie. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, in the book of Daniel, it says that Jesus is a cornerstone that's cut out. And that cornerstone, many people stumble over it because of the agendas that they may have politically or culturally. And it's ruinous sometimes because Jesus had this effect where when people have agendas that they might sacrifice other people to achieve, Jesus isn't down with that. But that cornerstone, in the book of Daniel, it becomes a mountain that fills the whole world. This is the expansion that of the kingdom of God that you're talking about, Nathan. And when that happens, it says that the ethnos, the nations, bring their good to the mountain in a celebration. And for
Hmm.
me, I really think that I don't want to be a party ever to like we get to the end of all things and we meet Jesus and there was something good that somebody was going to bring to the party. And I said something or did something that discouraged them for bringing that because I thought my way was better, right?
Hmm. Hmm. I think, and I mean, maybe just to add a little bit, I think we have this tendency to want to hold on to what is familiar with us or what we know, and it is part of our identity and a part of who we are. And we have a lot of fear of losing that, I think, as people. And that fear leads us to be quite defensive towards anything that is new and anything that's different. And I think you were referring to that earlier, Ben. The idea of releasing, going again back to that, the subtitle of the session, I think it's not so much releasing other people as it is releasing yourself from that
Right.
from that expectation of how things need to be, and trying to accept for a moment that the other person's differences is not a threat to who you are. You can continue to be who you are, and they can also continue to be who they are. And we need to we can live side by side that way. I, I guess I would encourage us all to try to sense that, try to find places in our interpersonal relationships, in our dialogue, to do that. It's not to say that on a societal level, there have been people's identities who've been threatened. It's true. And we don't want to ignore that. And we want to acknowledge how to work through that in those scenarios. But I also think it's true that often we hold very tightly onto our own identities to the point where we then go against other people's identities. And that's where I think we need to be careful and allow ourselves the freedom to accept other people's differences as well.
Yeah, that's a good point, Nathan. I mean, I think that there is a real threat and a real fight around uh around some sense coming out of fear that certain identities, groups of people should be suppressed. Like that,
Mhm.
there are some very
Yeah.
real things in the world today, even in the political discourse in our country. Uh, some people would say on the one side, cancel culture, and on the other
Mhm.
side, bigotry. And each group might accuse the other, and then the group says, no, we're not doing that. But there's some real fight there. What I would say is, even in a world where there is a chance, really, of people out of fear getting rid or suppressing people's identities, still our best plan, and really the only plan, is before that happens to live love now,
Mhm.
right? If we can release that and we live in love, that's actually our best way to make sure that never happens. Because
Yeah.
only love drives out fear. If I connect to somebody who's different and they say, wow, he connected, but he's this, that's actually an antidote to them ever feeling like they have to do something to stop my kind of person because I'm a threat.
Mhm. Mhm.
Right. And so if we act in love and cross boundaries, cross the street, cross across a label and connect in love, that's actually the best way of preventing a world where identities and groups and certain types of people are suppressed or prohibited, whether we feel like as a conservative they're trying to get rid of us, or as a progressive they're trying to get rid of us, or as a minority they're trying to get rid of us. It love is actually the way, not let's fight so that my group wins or can become victorious. I think that that's a false path and a false trap.
Definitely. And I mean, I think Jesus shows us that that just fighting back only makes things worse. And in his messages, that we have to show acts of love to get through. We might not always get love in return in all cases. And Debbie, when you were mentioning, well, how do I get outside of the box? If you might try to show an aspect of your humanity or an act of love to another person, and you might not always get the response back that you were hoping for. But I think that is the way eventually of getting there. And if we do fight back, we won't ever get there. But having that constant message of love and showing each other's humanity to one another, that will get through at some point.
Right. Thank you for that, Nathan. Well, we want to wrap up now. I'll be sending out session notes that will have everything that we covered in the session. Included there is actually some really cool projects that Nathan showed me about people that are having conversations and dialogue with people with far different opinions about gun safety. There's actually a group that together. They talk about gun safety in churches, and they work with Raw Tools, which is a group that receives guns in neighborhoods concerned about gun safety. Um, and anyways, they take these guns. I think it's so cool. They take these guns and they reforge them in a fulfillment of the Bible passage and actually make garden tools for doing community gardening out of these guns that people turn in these events. So anyways, I'll send out some of the information. You can take a look at it. But thank you so much, Nathan, for being in our call. I invite you all to check out all the different stuff MCC does on the peace building track. They do events around the country. They have a lot of resources, so definitely check those out. Thank you for all your comments, Nathan, and thank you all for being here. Peace warriors, people who are going to go out and love over the holidays, I just say a blessing on you. And if you need a place to develop some of that inner peace and deal with some of the conflict and the craziness and shed that, come on up to camp. Do a personal retreat here. We're open during the week. If you're willing to take care of your meals, it's an incredibly quiet place to be during the week. And camp's a great place to decompress and nurture that peace so that you can respond in the right way. So just remember we're here. Thank you all, and have a great night. And there'll be a link to the recording of this session along with all the resources in the follow-up email. All right, have a great night. Appreciate you all.
Nice. Thank you.